There is a judge in my hometown that keeps a statue of a horse on his desk. If he feels an attorney is beating a dead horse, he knocks the statue over. If the attorney continues, he starts tapping on the horse with a pen. There is a rumor that he once threw the statue at an attorney that didn't get the message. This is generally how I feel about biblical slavery. It's a topic that has been beaten to death. The apologists struggle and squirm to come up with some kind of justification for why their God would allow slavery, or they deny that their Bible says what it clearly says. So why am I addressing it again? Because the apologists evidently aren't done with the issue either. Paul Copan recently did an interview with Frank Turek on this topic, and he has 2 books out with chapters on the subject of biblical slavery. Is God a moral monster? And is God a vindictive bully? Does Copan have anything to add to the conversation, or does he continue to beat a dead horse? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. As we begin, Frank introduces our topic and his guest.
As for your male and female slaves who you may have, you may acquire male and female servants from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you.
Cool. He's diving into one that many Christians gloss over and sometimes don't even realize is in their Bible. Bequeath is simply the verb form of the noun bequest. When you leave property to someone in a will, it is a bequest. The act of writing the will and leaving the property to them is to bequeath.
To receive as a possession, you can use them as permanent servants.
Okay, that explains it. I was wondering why Frank was using this translation, and now I see it. Most versions say slaves or bondslaves. He wants this one because the word here is translated servant.
But in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another, unquote. That's Leviticus 25 and verses 42 and following. This appears to say that Israelites can actually buy slaves from foreign nations as a possession.
Yes, that is what the text says. Is the argument going to be that the text doesn't mean what it says? One would think that an omniscient God would be sufficiently versed in human communication to be able to speak clearly and not need some humans to tell other humans what he really means.
Does that really mean what I think it means? Because a lot of atheists and a lot of skeptics are claiming that the Bible believes in chattel slavery. We're going to dive into this very controversial and very complex topic today with my friend, Dr. Paul Copan, who's written several books related to this. The most recent is called Is God a Vindictive Bully? Reconciling Portrayals of Gods of the Old and New Testaments. Paul also wrote Is God a Moral Monster? He teaches down at Palm Beach Atlantic. He is a gem when it comes to these issues because they're very difficult. So here he is, ladies and gentlemen, the great Paul Copan. Paul, how are you?
Hi, doing well. Thanks so much for having me on your program again, Frank. Always a pleasure.
Why are these issues difficult? If Christianity really were a faith based on truth and communicated to man by a perfect God, this should not be an issue. A good God would simply tell his people that slavery was wrong, and that should be the end of it. If it's a difficult issue, It's only because the authors of the Bible made it a difficult issue for people with a modern sense of morality, as they failed to know that this was going to be considered unacceptable now, even though it was perfectly acceptable back then when they wrote it. Perfectly understandable for human authors of a human book. What doesn't make sense is for this to be the position of an allegedly omniscient God.
Paul, you're the go-to guy on this issue. You've done so much fabulous work on this. It is such a difficult issue.
Dr. Joshua Bowen is the go-to guy on biblical slavery on the other side. The only reason I didn't ask him to help me on this one is I feel like he has beaten this horse to death. Why make him do it again?
And I know you wrote Is God a Vindictive Bully in response to people who read Is God a Moral Monster and said, Paul, there's more, it seems, in Leviticus 25, what I just read, that needs attention.
That seems like an odd thing to do in a book that has 3 chapters devoted to biblical slavery. How do you write 3 entire chapters on slavery and manage to miss talking about the primary verses that unbelievers keep pointing out to you on the topic? The answer is the book wasn't written to refute arguments. It was written to assure the faithful. No need to tackle the tough issues when glossing over them will soothe your audience. But clearly it was insufficient, as Copan had to write another book to address the real issue.
But yeah, there has been that that challenge to look at this text, and a lot of people make this distinction. Yes, you could talk about the Israelites who could potentially be indentured servants, but what about those pagans? Looks like you can mistreat them, you can abuse them, you can use them as objects, and so on. And there's a lot more to unpack here. And as we'll see, if people just read further in Leviticus 25, a lot of that same language that is used of those foreigners or those aliens who are living among you or sojourning among you, that same language is also applied to Israelites.
Why does this matter? When he says the same language, does he mean just that they are the same words being used, or does he mean that the same things are being said of the Israelites? We shall see.
And so we want to talk about that and say, well, there's a kind of an interchangeability of language here and a lot more going on that's part of the background of that. So I'm looking forward to jumping into this conversation with you.
Yeah, one of the things I want to point out to our audience, Paul, and you point this out in both of these books, that we all want the easy button when it comes to these issues, but it's not an easy issue. It's a complicated issue. And you need to have sort of a detailed knowledge of several other topics. And you being an Old Testament scholar have that knowledge.
Why? Is there really a God that wants people to know him? Why would that make it so difficult to do that? Sure, the issue of slavery specifically could be a complicated thing, dealing with cultures or whatever. I am sure that that is going to be a part of this discussion. But the base issue, and Copan alludes to it in the title of the books, is the character of God. Is God a good person? The issue isn't important because we want to throw shade on slavery practices of ancient people groups. It's because we want to know if there is a reason to think that your God is a good God. How your God deals with people and how your God directs his people to deal with other people are direct evidence of the character of your God. If trying to determine if your God is a good person or not is a complicated question, then you can't say that children can make that determination and can make a rational choice to follow your God. Does a person need a PhD in biblical studies or ancient Hebrew or Assyriology to be able to understand the evidence? If so, then no one without those degrees has any business believing in your God, as they can't know if they are following a good God or not. And if it comes down to people need to have trust in the people that have that training, then we aren't having faith in your God. We're having to have faith in people with that training. Is your God a good God at all, or just a God for the highly educated? One mark of a good attorney, actually a good communicator in any field, is the ability to take a complex subject and be able to explain it so that even a child can understand it. Maybe the child won't understand the nuances, but at least the child will get the general concepts. If this issue, which goes to the character of your God, can only be understood with much study, then your God has failed to clearly communicate the evidence of his character in a way that can be grasped by most people.
I just want to list a number of things you need to know if you want to know this topic in detail as it was intended to be known. First of all, you need to know the distinctions between slavery described in the Bible and slavery in the pre-Civil War era in America. We'll get to that.
This makes absolutely no sense, Frank. Think about what you just said. One cannot understand what Leviticus 25 means unless you understand the difference between slavery described in the Bible and slavery described in the pre-Civil War era in the United States. So no one could understand Leviticus 25 until after the Civil War in the United States? None of the Israelites could understand Leviticus 25? Jesus could not have understood Leviticus 25. Josephus could not have understood Leviticus 25. No one anywhere in the world could have understood Leviticus 25 until 1865? Why the blazes would God send a message to his people that he didn't expect anyone on the planet to understand until nearly 3 millennia later? What Frank means is that because we know of antebellum conditions, he wants to draw a distinction between that and Leviticus 25. But suppose we didn't. Suppose we never heard of any form of slavery other than that which is written in Leviticus 25. Would we not be able to understand it until we learn about antebellum slavery? If the only point here is to say that slavery in ancient Israel isn't the same, then no, one would not need to know anything about antebellum slavery. One would only need to know that it's irrelevant. I think the only reason Frank listed this here is he wants to make Copan come out the great scholar for having unpacked all of this. But what Frank is instead doing is making the case that his God isn't for the masses, but only for the great scholars.
You also have to know something about the ancient Near East culture versus Western culture.
Same response.
You have to know about translating certain words in Hebrew, which, Paul, you do a great job of in the book.
This brings up another problem. If the Bible is supposed to be a book for all people, for all time, why is the translation of it not so simple that there is no disagreement as to how it is to be translated? God is supposed to have invented all the languages. He's supposed to have confused the languages at Babel, creating all the existing language families. So why is the Bible not easily translated from one language family to another, all of which God created? If translation is complicated work, and it is, God has only himself to blame.
You have to know the purpose of the nation of Israel and its laws and the limited scope of the Old Covenant and its laws.
Again, why? Is understanding God only for the scholar? How about knowledge of the surrounding areas and their laws? Laws about slavery in ancient Israel differed little from other countries in the region in its time. Why did God find it necessary to copy the surrounding cultures?
You also have to know something about the ability or inability of people in the land of Israel. Could they own land? That had something to do with this.
We'll get back to this one. I want to let him flesh it out before addressing it.
You have to know the difference between a prescription and a description in the Bible, including the concept of case law.
Frank continues to dig the hole deeper, making the case that his God is not for everyone.
We'll see as we go into this discussion as well, ladies and gentlemen. You have to know the difference, or you have to know the fact that people entered into slavery or servitude, as we'll see, for their own economic benefit, because it was more secure than being a day worker in this agrarian society that didn't have welfare.
Sometimes, but not all slaves in the society were indentured servants. The Bible clearly calls some slaves indentured servants and others property.
You also have to know something about Roman laws in the New Testament.
Seriously? One can't understand what ancient Hebrews were doing unless you understand Roman law? The Hebrew scholars prior to Rome never understood their own text because Rome wasn't built yet?
And you also have to know that there was a universal acceptance and perceived societal need of slavery throughout history.
Yes, that is how we know there is no objective morality. Morality shifted significantly with the Enlightenment. It was the Enlightenment that gave us the philosophers that laid the groundwork for understanding why slavery is wrong. There was a perceived need for slavery, which wasn't real, only perceived. That your God, the alleged God of objective morality, did nothing to dissuade. He had no problem with telling the people not to worship other gods, despite the perceived need for many gods, and yet somehow he was unable to communicate his morality on this topic. Why is that?
Paul, please set the table for us. When it comes to the opening chapter of Genesis, because there's something in the opening chapter of Genesis that really feeds into this issue.
Right. Of course, Genesis 1 tells us that both male and female are made in the image of God, that there is this intrinsic dignity that is God-given, that this is something that then helps to shape the vision of the Old Testament and also brings us into the New, where you see that human beings are described as being made in the likeness of God, James chapter 3. So at the very beginning, we see in the created order that God has made this, given human beings this fundamental equality. There is no intrinsic hierarchy. There is no class system at the very beginning. We see that there is, in this sin-free state, this fundamental equality between male and female, that there is no classism introduced at the very beginning. That is a result of the fall.
It is not the result of the fall, but of the curse. After the fall, it's God that declares that the man will rule over the woman. It isn't that he just starts doing it. It really irks me when I hear someone, especially a parent, say, "Look what you made me do," referring to their own actions. Like when a child provokes a parent and the parent hits the child, saying, "Look what you made me do." No, the child did not make you do that. You chose to do that. The child may have provoked you to act, but you chose how you will act. It's the same thing here. Even if we took this story to be literally true, no one forced God to cause the man to rule over the woman. God chose to mete that out as his punishment. Worse, this God is supposed to be omniscient. He's supposed to be in control of the universe, yet he was unable to stop this. If this God is the all-powerful being you claim him to be, he caused this by creating the world in which he knew this would happen if he chose to create it. He caused this. Not only the inequality of the sexes, which, if it was the result of the fall, humans are working on fixing it for him, you're welcome, but if the inequality of human value and slavery are also the result of the fall, God would be the engineer of that too. Humans got rid of slavery for God too, or at least it's no longer legal. Your God seemed incapable of righting that wrong as well. Why is your God so bad at communicating what he considers moral that it takes humans several millennia to get it for him?
And so when God steps into the world, as it were, in working with Abraham and then Israel and so forth, God is entering in and giving a law to people who are already broken, fallen. The structures of society are corrupted.
And whose fault is that? Did God not know that this would happen if he chose to make the world we live in? Yet he chose to do it anyway. Who had a choice in how the world was made? God or the people who inhabited it?
And so this is, again, has a great bearing on the issue of slavery and how we are to understand that. And what we'll see is that God steps into a world that's already broken, but offers his people, kind of meeting them halfway, or to accommodate them perhaps, but also to set them off in a redemptive direction.
Set them off in a redemptive direction by telling them how to treat their slaves? By not telling them that slavery was wrong, letting them figure that one out for themselves? Not only does what Copan is saying not make any sense, if it were true, the world was set off in a preferable redemptive direction by Hammurabi. Under the Code of Hammurabi, slaves went free after 3 years of service. Under the Hebrew law, it was 7. If God is trying to set humanity on a redemptive path, he should have gotten out of the way of Hammurabi. Humanity was on a more humane path before God stepped in with these rules that are more harsh than those of the surrounding nations.
So God, we see a greater legislation, as it turns out, than what the surrounding nations have. And we see a vision that is informed by that fundamental equality. And there is this drive to move people to keeping that fundamental equality in mind as things move forward toward the New Testament, toward the Messiah, and the incorporation of Jews and Gentiles, male and female, slave and free, into the body of Christ.
So God starts in Genesis 1 saying that everybody's made in the image of God. That's the ideal.
And again, if that were your God's intent, he is a miserable failure, because the people were still using the Bible, even the New Testament, to justify slavery until the Enlightenment. It took another 1,600 years before people started having empathy for their fellow humans to a sufficient degree to do something about the slave trade. Either your God is a really bad communicator, as none of the original people given the message ever even understood the message, or God is a bad creator that made people too dumb to understand the message. That's the problem with serving a triumphant God. He's supposed to hold all the cards and be in control of everything, and yet, whenever things don't go right, you want to blame the people that are allegedly the way he made them to be. So take your pick. Is God in control or isn't he? If he isn't sovereign and he isn't God. If he is, then he's responsible.
By the time Moses writes the Torah, we're in 1400 or so BC. What's the status of slavery around the world at that point? And what kind of slavery is it, Paul? Is it the kind of slavery that we had in the American South prior to the Civil War? What was it like?
Yeah, for example, you do have servitude, slavery, and I guess you could technically call what Israel is experiencing in Egypt as a matter of serfdom. That they're simply, the state owns the land, the Israelites are working it, they can perhaps have their own crops and so forth, but fundamentally they've got to do what the ruler says, and that their work is going to be for building pyramids or building storage cities or whatever.
Copan isn't clear here, but it seems that he is walking back the slavery that God is supposed to have freed the Hebrew people from. It would seem that what he is saying here is that God didn't bring the Hebrews out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. No, God simply allowed them to leave their sharecropping or tenant farming arrangement. If this is the case, Dr. Copan, why does Moses need Pharaoh's permission for the people to leave? He's been told about the promised land. If they are not slaves and they are free to go, what's with all the plagues? Copan seems to be completely rewriting the book of Exodus to try to accomplish his view of slavery. That's okay, Dr. Copan. We all know that this is just a story and not history, so you can turn it into the fan fiction that you want it to be.
But that is the sort of thing that you pick up on with regard to the ancient world. You do have potential for, you have concern, for example, in ancient Near Eastern laws about widows and orphans and so forth. But what's unique about the Israelites is that they say you've got to look out for the foreigner, for the alien in your midst. That is a unique element that I think a lot of our discussion is going to be informed by.
The Ebla tablets would beg to differ.
But God is often creating conditions for the people of Israel so that indentured servitude, for example, won't become a reality. And so we see things like God providing gleaning laws where people can pick fruit from the trees of their neighbors, or grain, like in the book of Ruth, grain from someone's field, in order to keep them out of having to sell themselves into servitude or contract themselves out for 6 years.
Why not just send manna? How about making the land produce food in such abundance that the people just give it away? Allegedly, the spies to the promised land saw that it produced giant grapes. If the land was this fertile, the people would just be giving away food and no one would be poor. If, for whatever reason, God is unable to provide for his people, he could just send them to Babylon, where they would only need to work for 3 years as indentured servants before they were again free. If the plan was to make life better for the Israelites, to create a system where they are unlikely to fall into poverty, he failed.
Unlike other ancient Near Eastern cultures, which did not have gleaning laws, they did not look out for foreigners. They charged high rates of interest.
I'll grant him this one. But what does it have to do with slavery?
You have a hierarchical system in these surrounding nations, whereas you have a fundamental equality that even the native, as well as the alien, the native and the alien, are both basically living under the same law, as Leviticus 24:22 says. That so the chapter just before says there's basically this fundamental law under which both the alien as well as the native are to live.
Yes and no. The law is in the same code, so if that's what he means, yes. But the rules were clearly not the same. One example is how the differentiation between how the slave was treated if he was injured, as opposed to how a non-slave was treated. Dr. Joshua Bowen discusses this difference.
Because if you read verses 24 and 25, it's following on this discussion about the scenario where two men are fighting and they accidentally hit a pregnant woman. And the pregnant woman loses her child, loses her fetus. If only the fetus dies, but the woman is not harmed, then there's just some sort of like a monetary settlement that's made, right?
Wow.
However, if the woman is harmed, then the text says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, burn for burn, foot for foot, wound for wound, all that stuff, hand for hand. So it sets up that rule of like lex talionis, right? The law of retaliation. And so what that means, of course, for those that may have not heard this before, if the man puts out the eye of the woman, then she has the right, or really her husband, has the right to the eye of the guy that put her eye out. And what that would mean then is that the guy says, whoa, 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 don't take my eye. I will pay. How much can I pay you for you to not exercise that right to put my eye out? And so now it sets the value of the eye in a really effective way. But what's interesting about 26 and 27 is that it doesn't say, and if a master gouges out or destroys the eye of a male or female slave, or knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave, then the slave has a right to the eye or the tooth of the master. It doesn't say that because the slave is not due lex talionis. They're not due the law of retaliation. They don't have a right to the master's eye. And that's a pretty significant thing. What they are due is to have their debt repaid, which is far less than they would have gotten ostensibly from having a right to the master's eye. Because putting out the eye is a really significant thing.
Yeah, and worth a lot of money.
So it shows that the slave is not on equal footing in the eyes of the law to that master.
While Copan is talking here about the way foreigners are to be treated as opposed to slaves, don't forget that the rules allowed the Israelites to buy foreigners as slaves. I'm sure Copan will argue that the foreigners taken as slaves weren't really slaves. But this passage makes it clear that the rights of anyone called a slave were not the same as a free person. Clearly, there is no egalitarian system here.
And so God is bringing in these redemptive structures, even though in other parts of the ancient Near East, it's a lot worse. So if you want to find refuge, as it were, if you want to have a hope of something that is more humanizing and enabling you to flourish, if those laws are kept, come to Israel, because that is going to be much more to your benefit than it would have been in other portions of the ancient Near East.
If that were true, people should have been flocking there. They were not. This should have been the most thriving civilization of the region. It was not. If you read the Bible as if it were literal history, one would get this impression. But studying the history of the region tells one otherwise.
What are the essential differences between Old Testament slavery and the kind of slavery we had in America 160 years ago?
Yeah. Well, in the ancient Near East, I don't know if you wanted to go into Israel per se, but yeah, in the ancient Near East, kidnapping, for example, is prohibited, generally speaking.
It was in the United States in the antebellum South as well. Most of us are familiar with the story 12 Years a Slave, which leaves one with the impression that kidnapping free people of color was legal. It was not. Let's again let Dr. Josh Bowen discuss this distinction without a difference.
But what they're doing, and I talk about this in the book, is they're drawing a comparison between what we know happened in the antebellum South and the laws in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And that may not seem like a big deal, But what they're not doing, to show the contrast, is they're not going to the laws that were on the books in the antebellum South and comparing those to the laws in the Old Testament. That's the comparison that needs to be made, because what they're doing is and they'll say it all the time, right? What do you think of when you see when you hear the word slavery? You're thinking about like the movie Roots, or you're thinking about whippings and tortures and all this stuff, because that's what happened in the antebellum South, but that's not what's allowed in the Bible. And guess what, folks? It wasn't allowed in the antebellum South either. That's what's so scary about this. Like, go read Thomas Morris's book on slave laws in the colonial South and the post-revolution and the antebellum South. Like, obviously, read the chapter in my book that talks about it, right? You can see all the footnotes. But I mean, really, when you read through the laws, you'll see that they consider the slaves, particularly after you get past the Revolution, particularly leading up to the Civil War. Like, the laws on the books, you have these judges, you have these lawmakers that are wrestling with, well, the slave is a human. And a good Christian wouldn't abuse and kill a slave. But master's got to be able to beat his slave with moderate correction. So what do? Right? He got to be able to motivate the slave, got to be able to make him work or her work, got to be able to do this stuff. Okay, so we have to make laws that both provide for protection of the humanity of the slave from being abused and from being murdered, but still allow the master to be able to beat them. Well, I mean, we see what happens with that, right? We see what happens when the law is not upheld, or there are loopholes in place, or the fact of the matter is that, like, this is what's so dangerous about this mindset of, like, well, look what the law is trying to do. Well, who gives a fuck? Like, sorry.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
I
in a
agree.
very real sense, who cares? Because what actually happens, right? And this is what's crazy, but you see it in the biblical texts themselves. Read through Jeremiah 34. You'll see that, like, the laws in Deuteronomy 15 about 60 to the seventh year release were just not being followed.
Copan here, as he was in the video Stephen and Dr. Bowen were reviewing, compares the laws of ancient Israel to the practices of the antebellum South. The practices and the laws were not necessarily synonymous. International slave trade was made illegal in the United States in 1807. By contrast, not only is the buying and selling of foreigners legal under Levitical law, the God of the Bible directs his people to offer their neighbors the choice between being their slaves or being slaughtered. Considering how few took the slavery option, do you really think that what they were being offered was a 7-year contract of indentured servitude? When the risk of death is the better option, clearly this is not a mere economical arrangement, as Copan would have us believe.
You also have something that's different. You have something that is more, you have servitude or serfdom, perhaps, that is based on ethnicity or kind of a tribalism, rather, and rather than, say, skin color.
What difference does that make? The moral problem here isn't racism, it's owning another person. Whether you bought this person because of how they look, how much work they can do, how many babies they can pop out, the point is that you own this person. That is immoral. If Dr. Copan doesn't get this, he doesn't just miss the moral high ground that he thinks he's on, he doesn't even know where to find it.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
You also have like I said, you have this, this understanding is some people, there are maybe different degrees of how someone was treated, but you do have in the antebellum South, you have slaves who are treated as property. And, for example, blacks were considered as having 2/3 the value of a white person in the antebellum South, the Dred Scott decision and so on.
How is the Levitical system any different? Not only do we see the slave having fewer rights in the case of injury, as Dr. Bowen said, we also see different prices for different slaves. Female slaves were cheaper than male slaves. People were not of equal worth.
You also have this fugitive slave law, which, if a slave runs away because he's property, he is to be returned to his master. And interestingly, you have various extradition treaties in the ancient Near East, like the Hittites and Babylonians and so forth, that if a slave runs away to another land, then those people in that land are to return that slave to his master on pain of death for the person harboring that person, and the slave who returns is perhaps not just mistreated but even mutilated. The Israelites are distinctive in allowing runaway slaves running from harsh masters to come into Israel and to settle in any of their cities. And so certainly the issue is not going to be, oh, if you come to our land of Israel, come and be mistreated, come be treated as property, come and be deprived of your rights just like you were in other, in the country from which you came. No, that's ridiculous. And as you see how foreigners are to be treated, the orphan, the widow, the alien, this triad appears appears 36 times in the law of Moses, looking out for those who are the most vulnerable in society.
I don't know if this is true or not. I'm not going to bother diving into it because it misses the point. The point is that Israelites were not only permitted, but were even directed by their God to take other people as their property that could be inherited by their children. They are not indentured servants with a contract of servitude. They were their money, their silver, their property. Even if foreigners that weren't enslaved were treated well, even if the enslaved people were treated better than in other countries, it still remains that they were considered property, not people, and that is immoral. If one person needlessly sends a trolley to run over one person, and another sends the trolley to run over 5, yes, the second one has committed an act that is worse. But they both behaved immorally. We don't excuse the bad behavior of the first because the second one was worse. We consider both to be immoral. On the other hand, I absolutely see why Frank doesn't see this. He's already told us. He has no morals, because the atheists have stolen the moral code that his God was supposed to have given him.
And when we say we're atheists and we start bringing moral categories into the conversation, I'm going to ask, what's the standard you're using? It turns out the standard stolen from God himself.
But when we see the word slave in the Old Testament, say in Exodus 21, or even in Leviticus 25, which we read earlier, I think most people in America think, okay, I'm thinking of a person that has been taken against their will due to some sort of racial prejudice, and they are subservient and even being abused to do manual labor.
Frank, that isn't at all what I think. And even if it was, so what? Americans are not the only people in the world. We are not the most important people in the world. Americans have no corner on Christian theology. Whether or not the Levitical laws on slavery were moral or immoral is not impacted by what people in the United States think of when they think of slavery. That's like saying that Japanese women all wear kimonos because when people in the United States think of Japanese women, they picture a woman in a kimono.
Was that the kind of slavery that Exodus 21 is talking about, or Leviticus 25?
Right. Well, again, we can distinguish perhaps between the Israelite in servitude in Exodus 21 and then the foreigner in servitude in Leviticus 25. And so I think we can treat those separately, although there's a lot of overlap, as we'll see.
Okay.
But the term slave itself is very misleading because it does conjure up all sorts of emotive language related to the terrible. You think of Frederick Douglass and his narrative about his own experience and that of his family and being separated from his mother and so forth.
Is this really any different? The master owns the foreign slave. They are his property. He can leave them to his children. Could he sell one slave away from his mother? We don't know from this passage. There certainly isn't anything prohibiting that, nor is there any prohibition against leaving a female slave to one of your children and one of her children to another one of your children. Do you really think that the ancient Israelites would have seen such a practice as immoral when slavery was so entrenched in social norms, according to apologists, that God couldn't even tell the people no slavery because they would be unable to comprehend how they could get anything done without slave labor? If he makes that argument later, he will have undercut this one. To read into that passage that people weren't doing what we know was done in other parts of the world, particularly in the United States, is to read into the text what is not there. What makes you think ancient Israelites had post-Enlightenment moral standards? Just because you do? If your answer is that the ancient Israelites got their morals from a perfect God, then why was God unable to give them enough of these perfect morals to realize that owning another person is immoral?
And you read that and you think, oh, that's the slavery that the Old Testament is talking about. And again, that's very, very misleading. And unfortunately, a lot of modern translations have just used the term slave with all of those connotations that people bring to the text, and then they simply write it off, saying, oh, if that the Bible is endorsing slavery or it's talking about slavery in this way, I'm not having any of it. It can't be from God, and so forth. The problem is, I think that the term eved, the word for slave, sometimes, should be translated servant.
If we accept this, you undercut the Exodus story. Deuteronomy 24:18 says that you were slaves in Egypt, ebed. If ebed means servant, then the Hebrew people were not slaves in Egypt, they were just servants. The Egyptians were not cruel masters who owned them, they were just indentured servants that could leave, what? When their debt was paid? But they owed no debt to the Egyptians. This was just a sharecropping arrangement? If so, they could have left at any time, and the whole show with Pharaoh was a waste of time. You can't claim that you know that the word means servant here, but not there, when the context gives you no such distinction.
That is a more appropriate translation, because that word servant can be used in a very honorific way. For example, Joshua and Moses are called the Eved Adonai, the servant of the Lord.
And now you are undercutting your theology on salvation. Jesus is supposed to have bought you with a price. You are slaves, according to Romans 6. However, there are other verses that would say otherwise, that you are not a slave, but an adopted member of the family. Depends on which text you want to focus on.
And so it's used in a very positive way there. In fact, you read the book of Exodus, and God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, to let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. So they're moving from one oppressive servitude to a liberating servitude.
But a servitude nonetheless. Whether or not it is any less oppressive is a matter of opinion. The point remains that even if you admit here that the word ebed can mean and does refer to an oppressive servitude, as it does when referring to the Hebrews in Egypt, while simultaneously claiming it doesn't mean this in this passage, despite having nothing in the context from which you can draw such a distinction.
That term itself of the word servant or slave comes from the word work or worker. In the Russian, the word rab, servant, is related to the word работать. That is a kind of close comparison there.
What on earth does that Russian translation have to do with this? None of the Bible was written in Russian. How it is translated into Russian has no bearing on the Hebrew meaning.
And so there is this servant is someone who is in a dynamic dependency relationship with someone to whom he is obligated. It can be positive, it can be negative, it can be neutral.
True, but it doesn't overcome the fact that you still have people owning other people. That is immoral. That is the problem.
But so often that word slave is inherently negatively loaded for our modern readers, whereas in earlier English or German or Spanish or Dutch translations, the word was more like servant rather than the modern day renderings in those languages of slave. And so I think we need to understand that this is a problematic, something that we just have to deal with and say the language itself, in a sense, biases the casual reader looking at the text, and then again with all those emotional issues related to colonialism and antebellum slavery, that we need to really address that. That's one of those things that requires more than 2 minutes to take care of.
So your point is that the word slave does not carry negative moral connotations in languages other than English? It's an English-only issue? If that were the case, why is slavery legally outlawed in every country? According to Rosa Luxemburg's Stiftung, it carries the same connotations in other languages. Even more so in Europe. On this continent, the Latin terms for men and women who are property of other people Sclavus, sclava, have seeped into many languages, but specialists in historical linguistics do not agree on the details of the word's migration. Even the origin of the word is controversial. Does slave really come from Slav? Most specialists agree that it does. It started in the Balkans, from about the year 500 onward. The English language didn't even exist in the year 500, yet somehow a word existed with negative connotations that eventually came to be the word that we use for slave. Perhaps Dr. Copan should have cited a source for his claims. I know some in my audience are not from English-speaking countries. Leave a comment about how the word slave is viewed in your language. Anything other than the immoral practice that it is?
Yeah, it does. In fact, it's interesting. The King James Version doesn't use the word slave. It does use the word servant.
Right.
But the more modern translations tend to use the word slave. I'm wondering, why is that? Why do they use the word slave, knowing that modern readers would have a different idea of slave when they read it in that context?
Frank, you should know better than this. First, you should know of some of the problems with the King James translation and why it isn't as accurate a translation as some of the others. Second, the Wycliffe Bible and the Tyndale translations were made before slavery was illegal. How does Wycliffe translate this? A servant and a handmaid be to you the nations that be in your compass, and of the comelings, the which be pilgrims with you. For your slaves and your slave girls, buy thou them from the nations that be all around you, and from the newcomers, who be foreigners or strangers among you. Either they that be born of comelings in your land, ye shall have these as servants, and by right of heritage ye shall leave them to your aftercomers, and ye shall wield them without end. Or they who be born to newcomers in your land, ye shall have them as your slaves, and by right of inheritance ye shall leave them to your aftercomers, and so ye shall own them forever. I see the word slaves in there several times. This does not appear to be a modern translation, judging from the antiquated language. This is clearly a reference to chattel slavery that predates the United States even being a country, let alone any conditions in the antebellum South.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, the word is, there's only one. It's actually not even the Hebrew text, but in Jeremiah, the word slave is used, but it's for kind of smoother reading by the translator. But you're right. There is, that this is something that is kind of a head scratcher, because why would you load this language with such emotion after colonialism, the antebellum Southern slavery? You have, the Emancipation Declaration, you have the Civil War, you have all sorts of things, up to, Jim Crow laws and racism in the United States. Why cause all these further headaches and misunderstandings? It seems that, and Peter Williams, a biblical scholar at Tyndale House in Cambridge, talks about how the language needs to be pulled back to preserve the negativity, both the kind of neutrality of the word eved. It can be used either positively or negatively or neutrally, just depending upon the context. So don't weight it with further emotion.
Possibly the translators were being honest in their work. The word means slave. The context shows that it clearly refers to chattel slavery. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the words bondservant and slave are synonymous. It isn't the translators adding loaded language that are creating the problem. The problem existed in your Bible before the United States even existed. It's the apologists that are trying to read modern morality into a Bible that doesn't support their claims. For your mental gymnastics, you score a 5 out of 10. You didn't stick the landing.
If the Israelites are servants in the land of Egypt but are being oppressed, then you take that as such. But don't load the language so much that it creates all these misunderstandings to the modern mind.
So the whole idea that God delivered the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt is just fan fiction. In reality, they were just oppressed servants. Question, Dr. Copan. If the Hebrews were just oppressed servants in Egypt, why did they not leave? As I mentioned earlier, they were not debt slaves. They owed no debts to the Egyptians. If they were oppressed sharecroppers forced by Pharaoh to do other tasks, why not just leave on their own? If they were forced to do labor for Pharaoh without wages and were not permitted to leave, and had been in bondage, as were their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents, because they were inherited property of Pharaoh for, say, 400 years? Is this not the exact definition of chattel slavery? What amazes me is that he goes to such lengths to deny the immorality of his God, but fails to see how he is denying the whole origin story for the Israelite people. Now, I will grant you that the origin story isn't historical. It really is just fan fiction. But I don't think Dr. Copan wants to go there.
Why was indentured servitude needed in that society? And what is it? First of all, what is indentured servitude? How would we define that?
Right. Yeah, the indentured servant is someone who is paying off a debt. It's a contracted labor, and that you are obligated to fulfill that debt.
What debt did the conquered Midianites have to the Hebrew people? None. None of these girls taken by the soldiers were indentured servants. Here they are, listed with the sheep, cattle, and donkeys as spoils of war. The plunder remaining from the spoils that the soldiers took was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 women who had never slept with a man. They are property, just like the sheep, cattle, and donkeys. Or did the animals sell themselves into indentured servitude too? When they pay off their debts, then what happens? You send them on their way?
If you're coming over to the New World from Europe and you need to pay passage, you can't pay it right away, but you go to the New World, you pay off that debt, and then 7 years you're free to go around like any free citizen would. But you have that contracted work for a period of time.
And what, pray tell, is the contracted period of time? When the text says you can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them your slaves for life?
So the indentured servant is one who is operating that way in Israel. You have a 6-year term limit, which again is a unique feature in the ancient Near East in terms of the law collections. You might have a king who might say, in a couple of years I'll give you freedom or whatever, but there's no regulated, mandated freedom.
Nope, it was only 3 years under the Code of Hammurabi. Copan should stick to philosophy. He's not very good at apologetics.
The matter of chattel slavery has to do with the buying and selling of slaves as property without regard to their dignity, their freedoms, their autonomy. And so basically, and I think what the evil of slavery is, and again, sometimes you can talk about chattel slavery, but you can have sometimes people who are, quote, bought and sold, but is it actually chattel slavery where they're simply objects? What the real issue is, what the true evil of slavery is that one person is basically the owner of another person, body and soul, as it were, and that this person, has been stripped of all dignity, of all rights, and so forth.
Cool. So Dr. Copan is not a woman whose family has been killed in war and has been taken as spoils of war and is listed with the sheep, cattle, and donkeys as spoils of war that your God specifically said his people could take for themselves. Is such a girl not stripped of her autonomy, stripped of her dignity, stripped of all rights, and so forth? How can you possibly claim that this is not chattel slavery when it so clearly fits the definition that you gave for chattel slavery?
That this person is at the disposal of his master and perhaps even being potentially killed, as we would see in the antebellum South.
Killing slaves was not legal in the antebellum South either. It just wasn't prosecuted. What makes you think that this was not the same here? You are not comparing apples to apples. You are comparing Israelite law to U.S. practice. If you compare law to law, they are the same. Since the practice here did not match up with the law, what makes you think that the practice there did? Have you any source to back your claim? These women were used for sexual purposes. Personally, I'd rather be killed than have to live with an owner that can use me for his sex slave for life. We'll pick up mid-reading of Leviticus 25 by Frank.
It is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom you may have produced in your land, they may also become your possession. And it says you can bequeath them to your sons. This sounds like chattel slavery. And a lot of scholars will say, hey, that's what the Bible's teaching here, Paul. You say that's not the case. Why are they wrong?
Okay. Again, I would say that this is the most challenging passage for any of us to deal with.
Because it doesn't say what you want it to say?
For one thing, there's the context. We could talk about in chapter 19, the alien, the Hagarim, and the sojourner, the Hatoshavim, sojourners who live as aliens, that the Israelites in chapter 19 of Leviticus, same book, are commanded to love the alien in their midst and not to take advantage of him. So whatever the text is saying, it is not permission to abuse or to disregard the rights and dignity of the alien who is dwelling in your midst.
Copan makes a good point, but which brings up a subtlety that I had previously missed. Leviticus 19:33-34 does command the Israelites to love the foreigner who resides with you. However, Leviticus 25:45 says you can buy the foreigner that temporarily resides with you. Evidently, the love and goodwill the Israelites are to have for immigrants with permanent visas doesn't extend to foreigners with temporary visas. Sounds a lot like the attitude of the current administration of the United States as well. Guess they didn't have to be nice to those illegal immigrants either. At least here in the United States, we aren't following Levitical law and making them slaves for life.
We have, secondly, the context of chapter 24 in verse 22, where it says that the alien and the native are to both live under the same basic law.
Not really. It does say that the penalties for breaking the law are enforced on the foreigner the same way that they are for the native born. It does not follow, therefore, that a foreigner has the same rights as one who is native born. Dr. Copan, since you are fond of drawing parallels to the United States, let's continue to do so. In the United States, if a foreigner breaks a law, they face the same penalties under the law as one who is native born. But that doesn't mean they enjoy the same rights. They don't have the right to vote. They do have the right to due process if they are charged with a crime, but they have no right to remain in the country. In some circumstances, they can be deported without even a deportation hearing. Being included in the penalties for breaking the law does not make the foreigner have the same rights under the law.
So that there is to be this fundamental regard for the dignity of both the Israelite as well as the person who is from another country and living in Israel.
We have similar laws, and yet in practice we treat foreigners so badly right now. Foreigners are afraid to come to this country to speak at conferences for fear of being detained and mistreated by ICE and deported, sometimes to a country of the United States' choosing and not even their native land. Document that ancient Israelites did better. Now, notice that this is not a command. This is not prescribed. A lot of people think, oh no, this is a prescription. You ought to do this. No, it's something that you may do. I know of no one that thinks that. Be that as it may, when was there ever a prescription in the United States that people ought to buy slaves? The fact that people were not directed to buy slaves doesn't make the legality of chattel slavery a moral practice. So how does a person acquire, and keep in mind the word acquire is the same word used later on in chapter 25, the same chapter, that refers to a foreigner. So, again, the sojourner who is living as an alien among you, the Hatoshavim, Hagarim, that connection, the same words are used, but it is now referring to someone who has prospered sufficiently. So keep this in mind. You have these people who are working for you, these pagan servants who are working for you. But it also says, if you keep reading the text, that that person may become a person of means within Israel to the point that he may, quote, acquire, the same word kana, as we see here in this text about foreigners. It is applied to the Israelite. The foreigner can actually acquire an Israelite servant
to work for him.
Dr. Copan, are you sure you are reading the text correctly? He's referring to verses 47 to 48, but there's nothing in the text to indicate that this foreigner was ever a servant to anyone. It talks about a foreigner who becomes rich, not a slave who becomes rich.
We have Obed the Gittite in 2 Samuel 6, who is actually entrusted with guarding the Ark of the Covenant. So he's a Philistine who is living in Israel, and he's entrusted with the guarding of this. So when you look at what's happening on the ground, are these people being treated as property, as objects, and so forth? No, just the opposite. These people are in respectable conditions. We can talk about Shebna, who is working for King Hezekiah. He's probably from Syria. That name is probably an Aramaic.
I cut out 3 minutes of him listing various people who were foreigners that were treated well in the Bible, a couple of who are referred to as servants. But this doesn't address the point. Even during the antebellum period, there were free black people, especially in the North in states that had already abolished slavery, that were servants. Some of the people fared well as servants. That doesn't address the fact that other people were owned as chattel slaves. Even if every Israelite freed his foreign slave, though he was not required to do so, still does not address the point. The point is that the God of the Bible permitted chattel slavery. If the people were not the moral monsters that their God was, and no one actually suffered the indignity of being the property of another person, as they were permitted to do, does that rehabilitate your God's moral failure in allowing this practice in the first place? But we know this was not the case. We still have the documentation of the 32,000 virgin girls that were taken as chattel slaves, at your God's direction, not just your God's permission. This was a prescription to take them as chattel slaves. To answer the question of your book title, yes, your God is a moral monster.
Why do people come to Israel? They may come because of famine. And look for a place to live. You can think of Ruth coming with Naomi and back to Israel in the book of Ruth.
Or they can be taken as spoils of war.
And of course, people who are in this situation can't acquire land, and so they're going to be living in households, perhaps from generation to generation. Although the assimilation process actually takes place in a generation or two, as Stuart Tyson Smith has argued. And so there is that assimilation process that is going on here.
And according to the Jewish Virtual Library, not only did some foreigners prosper in practice, some did acquire land. One thing unique to Levitical law was that the land belonged to God, and the inheritance of each tribe was a permanent possession of the tribe. Every 50 years was a year of jubilee, and all property reverted back to its ancestral owner. Any sale of land, whether to a fellow Israelite or a foreigner, was a lease, not a full outright ownership. One could buy the use of the land until the next Jubilee. The sale price is partially determined by how many years until the next Jubilee. Foreigners who had the means could lease land the same as any native-born Israelite. They did not have to attach themselves as a servant if they had means. A bigger question is whether this division of property among the tribes ever really happened. According to the Biblical Archaeological Society, besides the possible mention of the tribe of Gad in the 9th century BCE, Mesha Stele, historical sources from the Iron Age are silent on the existence of the 12 tribes of Israel. Indeed, not even ancient inscriptions from Israel and Judah make mention of these tribes. Taken together, even if Israel was originally a tribal kingdom, the truth behind the specific 12 tribes is less clear. Historical evidence for the conquering of Canaan also is lacking. If the basis for the claims of the land belonging to the Israelites in the first place lacks historical basis, on what basis can you claim that foreigners could not buy the land? Sure, your book says so, but clearly your book says a lot of things that are not so. It is a religious text, not a history book. But we are off topic. The question is supposed to be, is your God immoral for allowing chattel slavery?
But right now we're talking about the Old Testament, and probably the most challenging passage in the entire Bible related to this is Leviticus 25, which, by the way, happens to be addressing the Jubilee. We'll get to that here in a minute. But I want to point out, Paul, that you had mentioned that if people keep reading through Leviticus 25, they see, yes, Israelites can acquire foreign servants / slaves, But if they keep reading, they're going to run into this, verse 47. Now, if the means of a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, then it goes on to explain what to do. So, yes, the Israelites could acquire foreign servants, but foreign servants could also acquire Israelites as well. So this went both ways.
That isn't helpful. This is like the argument made by slaveholders in the American South that, yes, they enslaved African people, but people in Africa enslaved each other before Europeans started kidnapping them and selling them into slavery in various countries, including the United States. Just as that was not a justification for slavery then, it is not a justification for slavery now as to biblical slavery. It's still slavery. And as you yourselves articulated earlier, this is immoral.
Why not just prohibit all slavery outright in the Old Testament?
Finally, getting to the point. If your God were a good God, a moral God, this is what would be expected of such a God? So why not?
Right. Well, the prohibition, again, if you use the term slave in this very negative way,
Yeah, servant. Okay.
then this is going to color how you address the question. But if you understand the term servant as being something that can be sometimes it's a negative thing, sometimes a positive thing. Does it denigrate a human being? Does it strip that person of rights or not? Those are more fundamental questions to be asking. But when it comes to abolishing, well, just think of somebody who is a refugee, like in Isaiah 16 from Moab, fleeing to Israel and has no way of sustaining himself. What do? Well, you're going to attach yourself to an Israelite household. You're going to try to find some work through the kindness of the Israelites. Or if you're a runaway slave who comes to Israel, then the law says that this runaway slave is allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities. And so the presumption is that this person can attach himself to an Israelite household and find provision, find work to sustain him and so forth. And that this is another way of coming into servitude in Israel as a foreigner.
Once again, Dr. Copan seems to forget that the text is saying that they are your money, they are your property, they can be bequeathed to your children because they are your slave for life. Even if this is a servant that has attached himself to your family seeking refuge, making the law allow for you to take this person as your permanent possession, allowing you to beat him within an inch of his life, just so long as you don't kill him, is not affording the foreigner the dignity of personhood, of bodily autonomy, or of personal autonomy. By your definition, this is chattel slavery, and your God is immoral to allow it.
Sometimes you'll have people who are prisoners of war, and we read, for example, in Deuteronomy 21 of even entering into marriage after a period of waiting. And so there are different. So you see that there are different ways of coming in. There may be families who are trying to sell their own children because they can't sustain themselves or support their children. And so they will engage in some sort of a transaction. And so the Israelite could say, okay, this person could work for me. I'll take such and such an amount from you, and then this person will be working for me. And so there are different ways of entering into servitude, but it's not as though they're all terrible or somehow contrived. That this is institutionalized. It's sometimes a matter of accident, famine, runaway, warfare, refugee status, and so forth. So there's a range of things. But again, this is not a call to dehumanize those who are most vulnerable. And as I said, the alien is to be looked out for along with the widow and the orphan. This is repeated over and over again. It seems like the critics who point to this text totally ignore that reference to looking out for the alien and not taking advantage of him.
And you totally ignore all the times your God not only allows, but directs the Israelites to take advantage of the foreigner, like in Deuteronomy 20. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all of its males to the sword. But the women and the little ones, the livestock and everything else in the city, all of its spoil, you shall take as plunder for yourselves. And you shall enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not the cities of the nations here. But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. But you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded. Do we need to throw the horse at him?
If it was outlawed and you couldn't sell yourself to make money, what was your option? What could you do? Because if you couldn't own land, if you're a foreigner, as you mentioned earlier, the only way you could harvest crops to eat would be either to take the corners of the field that was Leviticus said you should do, but that would require work on your own part too. Exactly. That wasn't straight welfare, right? You had to go harvest it. Or if it's outlawed for you to sell yourself, so to speak, to somebody, how could that person survive?
Yeah, there's no real way of sustaining yourself. And keep in mind, we're often imposing our own modern standards of social supports and everything that have been developed over the centuries.
You mean like how our government refuses to allow for national health care, and paying for health care is the #1 reason for bankruptcy in the United States? You mean how our president refused to pay for SNAP benefits to our own citizens, preferring to see the people starve? You mean those social structures? This idea that there were no options for foreigners to work for wages in ancient Israel is false. There is nothing in your Bible nor anything historical that says foreigners could not work as day laborers for wages. Selling themselves into slavery was not the only option, as your Bible even points out. It talks about the prosperous foreigner, never at any point saying that the foreigner is the servant of anyone else. He is likely an artisan or merchant. Slavery was not the only option for the foreigner, just as it was not the only option for the Israelite. Finally, why could your God not simply tell the people to implement a system of social welfare? If your God can pop a whole new language into a person's head instantaneously like he allegedly did at Babel, why not just pop into the people's heads a morally just and humane system of social welfare? I find it flabbergasting that your allegedly omnipotent and omniscient God is unable to come up with any solutions to problems beyond what you yourself are able to think of.
I find your God's lack of problem-solving skills disturbing.
Could it be that maybe your God isn't real, and the only reason he behaves exactly as the people who do believe in him is because that's the only place that he exists, in the minds of the people who believe in him? Yeah, I think this horse has been beaten to death. Live your life.